They first came up in Buck Rogers, a comic book, radio, serial, just a very popular thing in the early 1900s, but the jetpack was obviously the coolest thing from it. And it inspired a lot of pop culture, but also inspired people in the real world to try to make jetpacks, including Wendell Moore, an engineer at Bell Aviation, the company, and he was one of the people at Bell that worked on the Bell X-1, one of the planes that broke, the plane that first broke the sound barrier. And so then there were other planes in the Bell series, the Bell X-1B, or the Bell X-1A. Chuck Yeager was having trouble controlling it as it's going really, really fast. And so Wendell Moore got the idea of putting little rockets on the edges to help control the edges of the wings. You can see them in the cutout here. So it helped control the plane going really fast. And then he was like, what if I put them on a dude? And so then got the Bell Rocketbelt. So for those in the know, they're rocket belts, not jetpacks, because it's a rocket engine on the back instead of jet engine, but call it whatever. So yes, there's the Bell Rocketbelt. Here's a picture of it. You control the thrust, how high up, how far the power on the right hand, the left lever is to steer it. So Wendell Moore just started working on a rocket belt because he thought it was cool because he's an engineer. But the Army was interested, like they were funding different things to make rocket belts. It seems like a good way maybe to get a bunch of Army grunts around from over the water, inspect from high up, do reconnaissance. So they started funding it. And then they got it working, and we're demonstrating it at various Army bases, demonstrating it to people in charge, the Army grunts, it works. It's, there's did a lot of different places, they, fancy flying, So now I'm sure you're all wondering, where's my jetpack? Jetpacks were real, they worked. The Army was interested, but we're not all using them. People were saying that we'd all be flying to work in them by 1990, but that's not the case. So there's a few issues with it. So if a plane loses power, it becomes a glider. It's not that difficult to land. If a helicopter loses power, it's that's not ideal. But the rotors keep rotating, and a skilled pilot can land it. But if a jetpack loses power, then it's just a rock and just plummets to the ground. There's absolutely no way to have safety equipment on it, just both because of the weight concerns and because of the heights that they would be flying at. It's not high enough to have a parachute or anything that would function, but it's high enough to really injure yourself, which a bunch of pilots started flying and then stopped after they did crash. And learning to fly is pretty difficult. This one pilot said how it took about 4 months to learn, on a tether. Others started learning and then crashed and were like, I'm good. So I wanted to mention Bill Suter. He's probably the most famous rocket belt pilot. He flew thousands of flights. He wrote this book that I really want, talking about flying rocket belts, and he described it as standing on a beach ball in a pool of water. So not super easy to learn how to do it. The sound is rocket engines on your back. The safe sound level is under 70 decibels. Above that, you want to avoid and the Rocketbelt was making 130 decibels. And so, you know, bad for the pilot, bad for reconnaissance or anything like that. It's just not ideal. The fuel that was used is hydrogen peroxide, which would turn into steam going through the engines, just very, very hot steam. And it's not like the hydrogen peroxide you have at home, where it's this low percentage concentration and not dangerous. It's this high percentage concentration that can just spontaneously explode. So it's a little difficult to store and work with. And then here's the biggest thing, is the weight. With the weight of the fuel and the pilot, the flights would last about 21 seconds, which is not really long enough to do anything that the Army would be able to accomplish anything in. You could have more fuel, but then everything weighs more, so then you're not really flying any further. So the Army was like, never mind, we're not going to fund the jetpack anymore. They went with the helicopter, which is much easier to transport people around. You might have heard of, there are some more recent jetpack companies who have said, oh, we're going to be making jetpacks that people will be using soon. And I would read about their big announcement and then nothing following up. There's just lots of difficulties with it. But 21 seconds, that's still long enough to do demonstrations, which is what Bell pivoted to doing. Bill Suter and some of the other pilots would do these demonstrations flying like at the World's Fair, at the Super Bowl, and then most famously, it flew in Thunderball. So this is the actual Bell Rocketbelt. So that's Bill Suter, one of the stunt pilots, flying, wearing a helmet because they're like, I'm not flying it without a helmet. Sometimes. Yeah, so some people don't even realize like it's not just a James Bond gadget. This was a real life thing. And the Bell Rocketbelt was in a few other movies and TV shows. And then Nelson Tyler was someone who saw one of the demonstrations at Disneyland and took a whole lot of pictures and made his own rocket belts because he was like, thought it was cool. And so then he started doing demonstrations with it. Most famously at the 1984 opening ceremonies, a billion people watched this. And then Kenny Gibson was a stuntman who would fly this jetpack at Michael Jackson's 1992 World Tour. They would do a switch so it would look like Michael Jackson was flying it. And Gibson brought in his friend Brad Barker to help with the distillation of the hydrogen peroxide fuel. The fuel was always an issue with any of these jetpacks. Gibson was working on the throttle. He was flying at Disneyland, the throttle broke. So Brad Barker was the guy who took it for repairs, but also copied the design, which is what brings us to the Houston story that people need to know about. If anyone knows Richard Linklater, this is a good movie idea, so just, I want to see this movie. The Jetpack Dreams, it covers the story, but it's covered more thoroughly in the Rocketbelt Caper. It's also a good book. So the main people in the American Rocketbelt Corporation are Brad Barker, someone in Houston who had various jobs, trying to find a way to make it big. His friend Joe Wright, who had a car audio place. This is the 1980s, so where you could improve the audio, the sound system on your car, since they didn't have great sound systems there, or install car alarms because people wanted that then. And then Larry Stanley, someone who came from family oil money but was looking for a way to make his own money. And so they were friends with Kenny Gibson and saw him flying his jetpack and copied the design. It's like, why don't we make our own? So they started working on a new jetpack in Wright's garage studio, our audio place. They got former NASA engineer Doug Malwecki to help with the design of the Rocketbelt. Someone who's worked on NASA stuff, knows how to make things, but also made Robosaurus at monster truck rallies, so he knows how to make cool stuff. And so they made it. It's in October 1994. It's made. It's not totally working yet. They had been working with Bill Suter, who's flown thousands of times and knows what to do with Rocketbelt. So they had a few improvements to make, but they're on their way. Except in November 1994, they started fighting about money. Someone had told Stanley that Barker was stealing from the company. They started fighting, throwing each other through walls. I'm imagining the Vin Diesel rock fight from Fast and Furious 5. So it's Barker. Eventually, he went to the ER. He came back with his arm in a sling. And then he grabbed a hammer and yelled, "I'm going to kill you, motherfucker," and hit Stanley with a hammer. Stanley said he hit him 10 times. Barker said it's only 2. So that, kind of broke apart the partnership between Barker and Stanley. So, the next day, Barker and Wright met with a lawyer to push Stanley out of the company and say, just us own the Rocketbelt. Stanley's out, and so Stanley obviously filed a civil lawsuit in response. So it's Brad Barker and Joe Wright, and then Stanley cut out. So they, Barker and Wright, they kept working on the Rocketbelt. They did test flights in 1995, and it was working. And then later in 1995, the NBA championships in Houston, and there was a big media day that the mayor hosted to be like, oh, look at this cool stuff Houston has, and one of the cool things was the Rocketbelt. Just flying from one boat to another in the Houston ship channel. And I'd been looking for this video for a long time, and it was, it's cool because it's a jetpack, but it wasn't quite as spectacular as I was expecting. But so they got it working. It's flying, and this is the only time it has ever been seen in public. Because the trial was kept going on. Stanley kept trying to get the Rocketbelt. Barker would not show up in court. He would say he didn't have it. He was given the runaround. Kept getting delayed, various things. I don't have time to go into everything. Around in the 90s, Wright declared bankruptcy. He'd had various issues. He spent a lot of money on the Rocketbelt, but just also people aren't paying to upgrade their car audio systems anymore. So he was needed money. Stanley said he would drop Wright from the lawsuit if Wright helped Stanley get the Rocketbelt back, and Wright said okay, that he would testify. So now it's Barker, he's on the outs, and Joe Wright saying he'll testify for Larry Stanley. But before that could happen, Joe Wright was found murdered in his house, beaten to death. So Barker was an obvious suspect. Violent, had a falling out, been described as volatile, but he was called in for questioning for a few days, but he had an alibi. There's no evidence there, but Stanley was absolutely sure that Barker must have done it. There are some other people I think are good suspects. Wright had various issues, and then, but it's still unsolved. But
Law and Order didn't?
But after that, the civil case eventually went on, and Stanley was awarded the Rocketbelt because Barker didn't show up, had been given the runaround, and Stanley was awarded $10 million in the Rocketbelt. $10 million because each other Rocketbelts that fly for demonstrations, they're paid about $25,000 each time, and expenses, and then also since Barker had been just doing a lot of shenanigans, I think the judge had awarded more. But Barker said, he continued saying he didn't have the Rocketbelt, and he also didn't have money, and also he said if he did have the Rocketbelt, he still wouldn't give it. Even if I had it, I would smash it into a million fucking pieces of the road grader. So it's just, later in 1999, Barker, gets a call from a stuntman he had known who was in Hollywood, said, hey, could you come out, do a stunt? Barker didn't have experience with stunt, but he knew stuntmen. He needed money. He was like, okay, I'll come out. But it was a trick. He got out there, and the stuntman pulled a gun on him and demanded to know if he had killed Barker and where is the Rocketbelt. Barker was put in this scuba tank box, would be taken out and interrogated. Barker would insist he didn't know where the Rocketbelt was. He didn't kill Barker. Went back in the stuntman was getting instructions from someone who obviously ended up being Larry Stanley. Barker was given a single slice of pizza and a cup of soup over 8 days, lost 30 pounds. One of the days he was put in the box and hears holes being drilled in the side, and hears one person say, is that enough holes? And then, no, the more holes, the faster it'll sink. And so he's, terrified. They didn't dump him in the water, but held him for longer. Eventually he did manage to escape, ran a few miles to a diner, called the FBI. The FBI took him back to find where the house was, and they found the stuntman with his car with what they described as a death kit. So it was good he did get out of there. So then Larry Stanley and the stuntmen were on trial for kidnapping for ransom, false imprisonment, and extortion. Stanley was eventually sentenced to life plus 10 years because he wouldn't admit guilt, because he mainly used the trial to try to find out where the Rocketbelt was. His main obsessions. After he did get sentenced, he was and wrote a letter to the judge, so his sentence was decreased. And so then, I'm sure you're wondering, where's the Rocketbelt now? And we still don't know. So it's out there somewhere. If any of y'all know someone's letter shaking in a storage unit, take a look, but who knows. And yeah, that's my talk.
Wow, what a story. That's great. All right, who has the first question? Okay.
Thank you so much. So since 2000, nobody's developed one or used one?
I mean, there are Rocketbelt, there are jetpack companies, Rocketbelt companies. I didn't include them because not a lot of time, but some that are come to our campus area, you can fly it around. Some where it's we'll be using them for medical transport or to go check on people, like hikers or something. Like there's people working on it, and there are also just amateur rocketbelt people. Like the Jetpack Dreams book starts with a rocketbelt convention of people, and some like building them in their garages. Like it's not that difficult to make one. I mean, probably to make one well, harder. But I think part of the thing is like if someone had told Larry Stanley, "Hey, you can make another one," that's not the principle of the thing. It's that it was stolen from him, and that is his rocket belt, and it just drove them both insane.
Next question. Of course.
So when you read the quote about him wanting to destroy, what was the guy's name again? The destroy.
Brad Barker.
Brad Barker. That immediately reminded me of the character from Fountainhead.
Oh.
Like wanted to destroy their construction without letting the world have it, which is like their version of like the individual is better than the collective. Do you have that same feeling with him saying that?
I mean, I think of this more like a crime movie where it's like, you know, some guys steal a bag of money and then turn on each other and go crazy. Just instead of a bag of money, it's a rocket belt.
All right. Good question from Carter Williams, Boston Nerd Nite, Orlando. All right, who else? Yes.
What inspires you about rocket belts? What excites you? Something must have really got you.
I mean, I'm an engineer, so I do like hearing about, you know, making things and just the innovation, but also I don't know, something about stories about people being driven to madness just also interests me. And also I've lived in Houston 20 years now, and I'd never heard of this story. None of the people I know in Houston had heard of this, and I was like, why aren't people talking about this? This is crazy. And I left out stuff because there's not enough time.
Excellent. Yeah, obviously you're Nerd Nite Pro. I was watching the timer. It was 20 minutes to this subject. All right. Is that any more questions? All right. Well, thank you so much.